Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining this session of Tech for Non-Techies. My talk is, so I had a look at the last talk on CICD from Tibor, and my talk is not going to be as technical as that one. Hopefully, it's not going to be boring as well. So yeah, we're looking at the CNCF. So what's the CNCF? What the fuck is the CNCF? Short answer, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And we can just go along with this and we're fine. We have the keywords in it: cloud, native, computing. Of course, it's fine that way. But this talk is more like a talk about a tale of standing on the shoulders of giants. All right, so we can't talk about the CNCF without talking about Linux, open source, containers, cloud, Kubernetes, and a lot more of that. So we cannot, go past the CNCF without looking at all of these things. So I'll go with some history first of all. Now, in 1991, all right, for some of us who are familiar with Linux, we probably know this story already. But there was this guy, uh, he made an announcement that he was going to release something that he had been working on. And yeah, so this is what that announcement looked like. It was a post to a news group, and he said, hey, hello everybody using Linux. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby. It won't be big and professional like GNU. And he says this has been brewing since April and is starting to get ready. I'd like any feedback on things people like or dislike in Linux, as my OS resembles it somewhat. All right, so this guy, Linus Torvalds, 21 years at the time, still in college. All right, he sent out this post that he had been working on this thing, and who knew? He said it wasn't going to be big, of course. And yeah, so before I move further, I'd like to first mention something about open source. So for me, this is what I think about open source. I think open source is a contract for collaboration amongst the diverse community of people, integrating the best of everyone for the good of all. This is something I was thinking about over the weekend. I attended a conference, an open source conference, and I was just thinking about what open source is. Because many times when you hear open source, one of the things that comes to your mind is free software. All right. So, but open source is not necessarily free software. I think it's a contract that people agree to, right, to collaborate on things like softwares, of course. And so that's what I think open source is. So Linus Torvalds made that announcement, and he said there was going to be a free tool for people, and yeah, the community began to pick interest in that in 1991. And let's move further. So later in 2000, um, Linux had become bigger than he expected. Linux had grown, all right. It was not just a hobby anymore. It was now a community thing. It was now being used by, hundreds of thousands of people, and everybody liked Linux at the time. Then in 2000, Linux Foundation was formed. And the Linux Foundation provides a neutral hub for developers to code, manage, and scale open technologies. Now, that was what the Linux Foundation was built for. That was what it was set up for, basically because of the Linux project that I started in 1991. Yep. So just a few notes on that. Now, the success of Linux was catalyzed, had catalyzed growth in the open source community. All right, people began to see the usefulness of open software, of work that had been done in the open and made available to people to use, and that was a really, really big thing at the time. And so Linux grew beyond just an open source kernel that was from a hobbyist, and it became something that was used in embedded systems, in IoT, Internet of Things. It was used in edge computing, automotive, security, blockchain, and of course in cloud computing as well. Now, this is a quote from Ibn Moglin. is director and chairman of Software Freedom Law Center, and he said this was when Linux was 20 years old. That's years later, 20 years later. He said Linux is 20 years old. The web is less than 7,000 days. Together, they have changed human civilization more rapidly than any pair of inventions in the history of the world. So I was looking at Linux sometime, I think last year, and it occurred to me that Linux was powering almost, I think about 80% of devices that are connected together. So you talk about mobile phones, you talk about smart homes, you talk about refrigerators, you talk about cars and servers, cloud. Linux was powering almost everything in every sphere. All right. And so Linux had grown bigger than 1991. And today, like I said earlier, in mid-90s, Linux came out first of all as an open source software. All right. In 1998, companies began to adopt Linux, IBM, Oracle, and some other companies began to use Linux. And today, like I said, majority of smartphones, Android is Linux, it's basically Linux. All right. So if you're using an Android phone or an Android device, that's Linux running under the hood. Yep. So come to talk about containers. Now, over the years, Linux was quite popular. Linux was in use by a lot of people, but there was this thing with Linux that it didn't have this interface that was interactive, well interactive with for people in the community. So these guys, they call them Docker Inc. They developed something. They developed a software that was, going to become a game changer. All right. So they built it around the concept of containers. Now, Linux already had containers at the time, but it was not as popular until these guys came into the market. And so Docker came and, 1 year, this is the 1 year anniversary, right? And they made an announcement that was just after they had come into the market. They were the cool kids in town. Like everybody wanted to use Docker because containers were now easy to use. So let me just give a rundown of what containers refer to. Now, say you're a software developer. Of course, we're not software developers, but we know what a software developer does. They write code and they build softwares. Now, you write code on your computer, and there was this challenge at the time. How do I take the code from my computer into production? How do I take it from my computer to a server so that a lot of people can begin to connect to my application and use my application, for whatever the application is meant to do? So there was this challenge where I'll take my software from my computer and I'll give it to maybe the operations person, the IT operations person, and they'll try to run my software on a server somewhere. And there we'll begin to see some issues like compatibility. The server is not compatible with my software. So there's some requirements that are missing. The ops person will have to install certain softwares, have to ensure that things are in place. Then the collaboration between developers and operations people was now a big issue. It was a bottleneck in the software delivery pipeline. So what Docker did was they said, okay, we can use containers, and containers will help you package your entire software, all right, into one. And you just take that single thing, that single unit, and give it to, the ops person, for instance. And the ops person doesn't have to worry about the requirements for your software. You just take that image that you've given to them, like a snapshot of a working system that you have developed on your computer, and they put it on the server and it runs out of the box. So Docker was going to power that thing. Docker was going to be the underlying technology for shipping softwares. All right. So that's what they came in with. And so it's a play of word. Of course, Docker refers to, if you're familiar with the shipping world, and you understand things like containers on the sea. All right. So they just took all of those terminologies and that's what Docker is. Yeah, so like I said, Docker was, everybody loved Docker now because of what they had done. They had brought in a unique thing, and they had given an interface to something that Linux already had, but they now made it mainstream. Okay, so in 2014, Docker announced their first conference, DockerCon 2014, and their first call for papers. And a lot of people submitted papers and all of that. It was going well for them. This was a startup that everybody wanted to work at. And in that conference, all right, some guys from Google, they had been working on something. So Google had been working on a project internally, for about 15 years before that time. And that project is called Borg. All right. It's one of the tools that they were using internally, just like us at Container Solutions. We have tools that we're working on. We have, for instance, we have the external secrets operator, we have Terraform examples, just something internal for Google. But at the time, Google needed to, take a share of the cloud computing market. So AWS was the rave in cloud, but Google needed something, to take a share of that market. Of course, they had the infrastructure, but they were not as popular. So some of the engineers came together, and product managers and a lot of other people, and they had the conversation. So they brought out the software or the tool that they had been working with, which is called Borg, and they decided to bring that into the open. All right, they decided to use that technology for the cloud, and that's how Kubernetes came to be. And there's a whole documentary on all of this, so you can just check it out later on. But at that conference, the DockerCon conference, remember this was 1 year after Docker had launched, and Docker was doing really well. They were raising funds and all of that. But Kubernetes, the guys from Google, they came and they announced Kubernetes in that conference. So this guy here said he was probably shy to announce that because everybody had a similar tool. Kubernetes was not the first, and Kubernetes certainly is not the last. It was not something spectacular. But after the conference, it was as though they stole the show. Everybody wanted to see what Kubernetes could do. All right. And that was from that conference. Unfortunately for Docker, there was a project which is similar to Kubernetes called Docker Swarm. And I saw in the documentary that the number of commits, that means the number of work that was being done on Docker Swarm dropped to zero, during the week of the announcement for Kubernetes. So that was really, really tough on Docker. You came to my conference and you just stole the show. All right. So this is Eric Brewer. I believe, I hope I didn't get that name incorrectly. And so this was him announcing June 10, 2014, announcing Kubernetes. And he said, yeah, it's yet another orchestration thing. Of course, I just put the acronym there, YAOT, because there's something called YAML, yet another markup language. So people that work with Kubernetes, they're familiar with YAML, which is called YAML, and they are usually writing YAML manifests to do things on Kubernetes. Yeah. Now, another challenge for Google is that Google was coming to announce something that was going to change the entire scene. But Google was a competitor. There was Amazon, there was Apache, there were a whole lot of other companies. Now, it will not be, Apache wouldn't release their engineers to sign a contract from Google. Like, who does that? Because of the competition in the market. And so Google began to think of, or the engineers in Google began to think of how they would make, because they wanted their software to be in the hands of almost everybody. They wanted their software to be ubiquitous, but it was not a good way to announce it under Google. So this is Craig McLaughlin. He made this statement. He said, if you want a technology to be ubiquitous, you want a technology to be used by everyone, you want a technology that can actually create that alloy that is stronger than the contributions of any individual, it needs to be held under open and free governance. So this was the thought at the time, and from the guys at Google, and they came together and they formed the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So this foundation was supposed to host Kubernetes. So Kubernetes was not going to come under the name Google anymore. It was going to be under this foundation, Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And so what is the CNCF? I saw this, I was seeing a video from Pini sometime, I think last month, and he was explaining cloud native. So he said cloud native, or CNCF, pardon me, is an open source software foundation dedicated to making cloud native computing universal and sustainable. Cloud native computing uses an open source software stack to deploy applications as microservices, packaging each part in its own container, and dynamically orchestrating these containers to optimize resource utilization. Cloud native technologies enable software developers to build great products faster. All right, so this was, CNCF at the time, and of course, CNCF was hosting just one project, which was, at that time Kubernetes, and a lot of people now began to get familiar with Kubernetes. CNCF was there to market what Kubernetes was doing, just talk about Kubernetes. They had people that were speaking about this in conferences and all of that. So if you look at the progression from 1991, we had Linux, all right? Then in 2000, we had the Linux Foundation. In 2014, 2013, we had Docker containerization. Then we had Kubernetes in 2015, and of course, the CNCF came out because of Kubernetes. So CNCF has grown so big just between 2015 and this is 2022. They've grown so big, and it's now of course, it's a community, but it's one of the biggest communities, and especially for us in the cloud native world, we cannot not know what the CNCF is. All right. So this is the mission of CNCF, to make cloud native computing ubiquitous. Cloud native, they want to ensure that cloud native is everywhere. Cloud native is accessible, by different organizations, different people, different governments, different, just everywhere. That's the mission of the CNCF. Now, like I said, CNCF is, of course, is a community. All right. They said they're a community of doers, who enable open source projects, including Prometheus, Kubernetes, Envoy, and a lot more projects like that. So there's 153K contributors to CNCF projects. That's massive. There's 782 members. That's over 700 members of the CNCF. I'm not sure if any new member has been added, but that's a lot. This is the one community that has gathered almost all the major stakeholders in the cloud computing space together. So this is really huge. And of course, they have certifications and meetups, for community work. So what's the role of the CNCF? Of course, the CNCF doesn't just do anything and everything. They're focused group, and they have their own particular roles. So first thing is stewardship of projects. Now, what do we mean by projects? What's projects? So Kubernetes at the time in 2015 was an open source project. So that's what we mean by projects. So there's a cloud native software that is coming up. People are working on something, and you feel this is cloud native. You can submit that project to the CNCF, and CNCF will provide stewardship, all right, for your project. Of course, they also foster the growth and evolution of the ecosystem. Yeah, that's what CNCF does. It's part of the things that they do on behalf of their members, on behalf of the projects that they have under them. And yeah, that's what they do. So they also promote underlying technologies, and they also do marketing, for all of these projects. Like I mentioned, they do training, do certification. Like some of the most popular certifications are the Kubernetes certifications, CKA, Certified Kubernetes Administrator. Then we also have CKAD, Certified Kubernetes Application Developer, and a more recent one, CKS, Certified Kubernetes Security. All right. And of course, they're community people. They serve the community by making this technology accessible and reliable. Now, under the CNCF, there is this thing called the CNCF landscape. It's not clear here, of course, because this just implies how large the CNCF has grown in just 7 years. Now we have a lot of projects. This CNCF landscape shows you the projects under the CNCF. There's a whole lot, and all of them are open source projects. All right. So from the release of Linux, all right, till date, people have been working on open source projects. And like I mentioned earlier, for us in Container Solutions, we're working with well, we have a Kubernetes tool called External Secrets Operator. Hopefully, I was speaking with Lucas sometime before he left, and I was asking him about applying to the CNCF to submit that project, and he said that yeah, that's in the roadmap, all right, but they're still working to make the project stable enough. Okay, so that's what this landscape is. So we have tools in security, we have tools in storage, we have tools in monitoring, we have tools in orchestration, just like Kubernetes. Kubernetes is an orchestration tool, and a whole lot of projects which are under the CNCF. You would find it on this website. Yeah, so one thing of course, it's an organization, and for the organization to thrive, there has to be a governing board, all right? In the CNCF, so the governing board is responsible for marketing and other business oversight, and of course, budgeting. Now, this governing board doesn't have anything to do with the technical direction or technical decisions of the CNCF. There's another organization, or there's another set of people rather, that is responsible for that. And quick shout out to Carla, who is also a member of the CNCF, and she's the marketing chair of the CNCF. All right, so I just added this slide today. Now, the Technical Oversight Committee is responsible for the technical vision of the CNCF. They approve new projects, they create, the architecture for projects, they align all the new projects with the plan and the goal of CNCF. So anything that has to do with the technical decisions of the CNCF, this is where they will first come to, the Technical Oversight Committee, or the TOC for short. And I think they're just like 11 people in that committee, right? And they have a tenure of 2 years. Yeah. Of course, I was looking through, one time I was looking through the membership page. I reached out to the CNCF on Twitter and asked if Container Solutions was a member, and they sent me this URL, and I was checking. I couldn't find Container Solutions there, but we can actually be members of the CNCF, and there is a whole lot of benefits and opportunities that we're entitled to by being members. So we have the platinum, we have gold, silver, end user, and academic and non-profit members. I think this is my last slide, perhaps. So another thing is the events that happen via the CNCF. The largest is the Cloud Native Conference, or the CUBE Conference. And about, if I'm not wrong, I think over 90,000 people attend the KubeCon every year. And that's massive. That's huge. From all over the world, people fly in to wherever that conference is holding, and they have this conference. So if you're in the cloud native space, this is one community to be a part of, because there you will find engineers, you will find project managers, people, all kinds of people in cloud native, and of course customers too. All right, so this should be my last slide. And how do you get involved? How can you get involved with the CNCF? You can be a member, like I mentioned earlier, there are different plans for different members, or different member groups, pardon me. And you can also be an ambassador. This is for individuals like engineers, like community members, and you just want to spread the mission of the CNCF wherever you are. So you can become an ambassador, you can just fill up the form and submit that to them. Of course, you can also, if you're a learner, there are different projects, like I mentioned earlier. For instance, if we get to submit the external secret operator project to the CNCF and we get accepted, then we can take mentors mentors who will be learning that tool that we have. Of course, they're learners. They could be students. They could be, postgraduate people, and they just want to learn about it too. So you can take learners in that space as well. Now, there's also community group. I'm part of KCD Africa, Kubernetes Community Days Africa, and that's one way you can also participate in the work that the CNCF is doing. And I think, yeah, that's all of my slides on the CNCF.